Donald Trump's 2016 victory sparked claims of a conservative cultural shift, but the MAGA movement has revealed itself as something far less subversive. While initially perceived as a threat to the liberal order, the movement's development shows conservative dissidents to be merely disillusioned liberals, distrustful of institutions yet philosophically incapable of replacing them. This contradiction stems from MAGA's unstated commitment to liberal foundations. Despite its anti-establishment rhetoric, the movement accepts core liberal principles, from individualism to market fundamentalism and the voluntarist conception of society. Its signature declinism, Make America Great Again, expresses not ideological dissent but temporal dissatisfaction, wanting to restore an imagined past rather than transcend liberal assumptions. These shared premises explain why today's real divide isn't between left and right, but between liberalism's contented and discontented factions. Until conservatives develop a critique that questions liberalism's anthropological and metaphysical foundations, rather than just its managerial failures, they remain what the MAGA movement has proven to be, not an alternative to the liberal order, but its melancholic echo. Without falling into the same nostalgic pitfalls of modern conservatism, we need to examine the pre-liberal past's understanding of ethics and politics. Aristotle wrote during Athens' 4th century BC decline, as Greece's city-state system crumbled following the Peloponnesian War. This devastating conflict between Athens and Sparta left Greek politics unstable, with frequent regime changes between democracy and oligarchy. The resulting institutional erosion was compounded by sophists, private teachers who championed moral relativism and taught rhetoric as a tool for personal advancement rather than truth-seeking. Against this backdrop of political fragmentation and intellectual skepticism, Macedonia gradually absorbed the weakened city-states. Aristotle's philosophy emerged as a direct response to these crises. Where sophists saw truth as contingent, Aristotle sought universal principles. Where they taught persuasion for private gain, he pursued knowledge for its own sake. Greek civilization had flourished through its pluralism, but now faced existential threats, both from external conquest and internal decay of values. Aristotle's systematic approach to ethics, politics, and metaphysics offered an antidote to the relativism undermining Greek intellectual life. At the heart of Aristotle's philosophy lies teleology, the understanding that all natural things possess an inherent purpose, or telos. As he states in the Nicomachean Ethics, every art and every inquiry, and similarly every action and choice, is thought to aim at some good. This fundamental orientation toward purpose manifests throughout nature. An acorn strives to become an oak, a knife exists to cut well, and a doctor's purpose is healing. For Aristotle, telos is not chosen but discovered, an objective truth written into the fabric of reality. Human beings share this teleological nature, with our ultimate purpose being eudaimonia, not fleeting pleasure but lasting fulfillment achieved through virtuous living. Aristotle explains this hierarchy of goods. Yet honor, pleasure, intellect, and every virtue we choose on their own account, for even if nothing resulted from them, we would choose each of them. But we choose them also for the sake of happiness, because we suppose that through them we will be happy. This distinction is crucial. Eudaimonia represents the complete actualization of human potential, not merely desire satisfaction. Each virtuous action simultaneously moves us toward this ultimate end while constituting it. The more consistently we act virtuously, the more we fulfill our essential nature and achieve genuine happiness. In this way, Aristotle's ethics presents not just a moral system, but an account of human flourishing, where virtue, purpose, and happiness form an inseparable unit. This raises the crucial question: how does Aristotle define virtue? At its core, virtue represents a golden mean between extremes, courage balanced between recklessness and cowardice. This mean is not arbitrary, but determined through practical reason. Yet Aristotle insists that reason alone cannot fully realize virtue. Human nature provides the essential context. Man is by nature a political animal, meaning we can only be understood within our political and social circumstances. The state, Aristotle argues, is prior to the individual, as an isolated person cannot be self-sufficient. Like a hand separated from the body, The individual loses proper function when removed from the community. Virtuous action transcends mere moderation. It must be exercised within the fabric of communal life. Virtue is socially embedded because human flourishing depends on mutual interdependence, both materially and morally. We cultivate excellence not as autonomous individuals, but as members of a shared political order. In summary, by practicing virtue within a community, we fulfill our telos as political animals, reasoning, cooperating, and thriving together rather than in isolation. True virtue is both rational and relational, a harmony of individual excellence and social duty. In the Greek polis, citizenship was fundamentally a matter of heredity rather than choice. One typically became a citizen only through citizen parentage. This system reflected a deeper worldview where political belonging stemmed from natural descent rather than voluntary association. Aristotle extends this principle to the family, which he considers the primary natural community and foundation of political life. Like citizenship, family membership is not chosen but given. We are born into specific familial bonds that shape our moral development. These inherited relationships carry enduring obligations. Barring extreme cases of abuse or neglect, children owe their parents care and respect, just as parents must nurture their children's virtuous development. This framework reveals Aristotle's distinctive understanding of freedom. For him, genuine liberty does not mean emancipation from tradition or external constraints, but rather liberation from internal tyranny. As he states in Nicomachean Ethics, the intemperate man is a slave to his desires, but the virtuous man is free because he acts according to reason. True freedom emerges when we master our baser impulses through rational self-governance aligned with virtue. Thus, human flourishing occurs within natural boundaries, the givenness of our ancestry, the obligations of kinship, and the demands of reason. Far from limiting our potential, these structures provide the essential context for developing excellence of character. Since Aristotle thinks of human beings as political animals who achieve their highest fulfillment through active participation in a virtuous community, the state's primary purpose, or telos, is not merely to ensure security, protect property, or guarantee individual freedoms, but cultivate moral excellence among its citizens. This requires more than passive governance. It demands well-constructed laws that actively shape character, encouraging citizens toward the good life. Unlike Plato, who was deeply skeptical of democracy, Aristotle offers a far more nuanced assessment. In his theoretical ranking of his 6 political regimes, democracy occupies 4th place, not the worst but far from the best. However, this ranking reflects an abstract ideal rather than practical reality. In practice, Aristotle argues that the most stable and effective government is a politeia, a balanced constitution blending elements of oligarchy and democracy. This mixed regime relies on an agricultural lower class that voluntarily abstains from direct governance, recognizing that political office requires education and leisure, qualities typically possessed by the wealthy. Yet Aristotle insists that the lower classes must retain sufficient political rights to hold the ruling oligarchy accountable. Without this safeguard, the oligarchs may exploit their power for private gain rather than the common good. In an ideal world, the best regime would be a monarchy governed by a truly virtuous ruler, a philosopher king akin to Plato's vision. Such a leader would possess the wisdom to guide the entire polis toward flourishing. Yet Aristotle acknowledges that such rulers are exceedingly rare. More often, states degenerate into factional struggles between the rich and poor, each seeking dominance rather than justice. These conflicts produce deviant regimes, governments that serve private interests rather than the common good. Aristotle categorizes political systems into 3 good and 3 deviant regimes. The good regimes being monarchy, ruled by a single virtuous leader, aristocracy, ruled by a virtuous few, and the politeia, a balanced mix of oligarchy and democracy ensuring stability through shared power. The deviant regimes are democracy, ruled by the poor majority for their own benefit, oligarchy, ruled by the wealthy few for their own gain, and tyranny, the worst form, where a single ruler oppresses the people. While monarchy and aristocracy represent the highest ideals, they are fragile, easily corrupted into tyranny or oligarchy if later rulers lack virtue. Politeia, by contrast, offers greater stability. Its mixed structure prevents any single faction from monopolizing power, while its inclusion of democratic safeguards ensures accountability. Aristotle's political thought balances idealism with pragmatism. He recognizes that the perfect regime is unattainable in practice, so the next best option is a well-constructed politeia, one that empowers an educated ruling class while preventing their corruption through institutional checks. This reflects a profound insight. Politics must acknowledge human limitations, striving not for utopia but for the best possible order within real-world constraints. The intellectual roots of liberalism emerged during the 17th and 18th centuries as Enlightenment thinkers mounted a profound challenge to traditional structures of power. This philosophical revolution targeted three pillars of the old order: absolute monarchy, religious orthodoxy, and fixed social hierarchies. The Reformation's emphasis on individual conscience and the catastrophic 30 Years' War provided both the ideological framework and the practical impetus for this transformation. At its core, early liberalism advanced two revolutionary propositions. Politically, theorists like Locke argued that government derived their legitimacy from popular consent rather than divine right, with individuals possessing inherent rights to life, liberty, and property. Economically, thinkers such as Adam Smith championed free markets and private enterprise as alternatives to mercantilist state control. Together, these ideas constituted more than just policy prescriptions. They represented a fundamental reimagining of human nature and social organization. This new anthropology found its starkest expression in the concept of the state of nature, as Hobbes famously described it in Leviathan chapter 13. This hypothetical condition portrayed humans as isolated atoms in perpetual conflict. No arts, no letters, no society, and which is worst of all, continual fear and danger of violent death. For liberals, this vision served dual purposes. It explained why political authority was necessary to escape the natural state's brutality, while simultaneously establishing the autonomous individual as the fundamental unit of moral and political value. The liberal project thus aimed to construct political institutions that would liberate individuals from both the chaos of nature and the oppression of traditional collectives, whether familial, communal, or religious. In doing so, it established a framework where personal freedom, rather than inherited status or communal obligation, became the organizing principle of society. At the heart of liberalism lies a foundational belief in the autonomous individual, a rational agent endowed with inherent worth, capable of self-determination and possessing inalienable rights that exist prior to political organization. This view understands society not as an organic whole, but as an aggregate of such individuals freely pursuing their interests through voluntary association. These core assumptions yield three key liberal commitments: political arrangements emphasizing democratic governance, as rational individuals can discern truth and participate in collective decision-making, Locke's consent of the governed; economic systems privileging free markets as self-interest properly channeled produces collective prosperity, Smith's invisible hand; educational priorities cultivating individual reason, reflecting liberalism's faith in human perfectibility, Locke's tabula rasa and Mill's progressive optimism. The utilitarian tradition from Bentham and Mill further refined this paradigm, framing human behavior as a rational calculus of pleasure and pain. This not only made moral reasoning empirically tractable, but reinforced liberalism's institutional focus on removing barriers to individual flourishing. Mill's harm principle crystallizes liberalism's conception of negative liberty. Freedom consists in non-interference, where individuals may act as they choose provided they not harm others. As he states in On Liberty, the only purpose for which power can be rightfully exercised over any member of a civilized community against his will is to prevent harm to others, a principle that continues to shape liberal democracies today. The liberal political tradition emerged from a revolutionary reconceptualization of human relationships to authority and community. At its core lies the principle that morally equal individuals holding diverse beliefs can coexist peacefully under a neutral state framework that guarantees equal opportunity rather than engineered outcomes. This philosophical shift enabled the dismantling of feudal hierarchies while paradoxically justifying new forms of inequality through market mechanisms, what would later be described as careers open to talents rather than equal results. The theoretical mechanism for this transformation was the social contract, a conceptual device explaining how autonomous individuals could voluntarily constitute political authority. As Locke articulates in his second Treatise of Government, men being, as has been said, by nature, all free, equal, and independent, no one can be put out of this estate, and subjected to the political power of another, without his own consent. The only way whereby anyone divests himself of his natural liberty is by agreeing with other men to join and unite into a community for their comfortable, safe, and peaceable living. This vision presents government as a limited, revocable trust established through ongoing consent, where individuals retain fundamental rights and the collective exists to facilitate individual flourishing. Locke's framework inherently contains revolutionary potential, explicitly authorizing the overthrow of governments that violate their fiduciary duty to protect natural rights. Hobbes' Leviathan presents a dramatically different social contract. The only way to erect such a common power is to confer all their power and strength upon one man or assembly of men, everyone to own and acknowledge himself to be author of whatsoever he that so beareth their person shall act, and therein to submit their wills everyone to his will, and their judgments to his judgment. Where Locke emphasizes retained rights and limited government, Hobbes constructs an absolute sovereign as the necessary price for escaping the war of all against all. This authoritarian version of the contract requires total alienation of individual rights to achieve security. These competing visions reveal liberalism's fundamental tension. Is political authority primarily a mechanism for protecting pre-existing individual rights, as Locke proposes, or an all-encompassing solution to humanity's destructive impulses, as Hobbes proposes? Both approaches, however, share liberalism's foundational move, reconceiving society as an artificial construct of autonomous individuals rather than an organic natural hierarchy. Patrick Deneen, a political science professor at the University of Notre Dame, has emerged as a prominent critic of liberalism, diagnosing its role in fostering social atomization and expanding state power. Though he gained wider recognition during the 2024 Trump campaign, particularly through Vice President J.D. Vance, who cites him as a key influence, Deneen had long argued against liberalism from Thomistic and Aristotelian perspectives. In his book Why Liberalism Failed, Deneen advances a provocative thesis. Liberalism did not collapse because it fell short of its ideals, but because it succeeded in realizing them. He contends that liberalism's foundational premise, the autonomous, rational, self-determining individual, is not only unnatural, but actively requires a liberal state to facilitate it.
Tocqueville is recognizing is that a liberal democracy, in a sense, doesn't start with individuals. It makes individuals. It makes us into ever more these individuated selves. In other words, the telos of liberal democracy is to create us into the creatures it imagines that we are by nature. But it requires quite a lot of art to make us into these creatures.
History reveals no evidence of humans existing in Hobbes's hypothetical state of nature. From their earliest emergence, humans have always organized themselves in communities. The very notion of humans as isolated individuals is philosophically incoherent. The individual and the community are inseparable phenomena, each constituting the other. Some defenders of liberalism might counter that the state of nature is merely a conceptual tool, a methodological device akin to a thought experiment designed to illustrate political theory. But Deneen rejects this justification. He argues that this foundational conception of humanity as essentially a collection of selfish, materialistic, and asocial individuals has profoundly shaped liberal societies. Far from being just an abstract premise, this atomistic view has permeated our cultural imagination, redefining our understanding of freedom, community, and even personal identity under liberalism. Liberalism's fundamental premise, the absolute primacy of individual freedom, transforms all social arrangements into potential obstacles. Any obligation or tradition not directly serving the individual's interest is viewed as an intolerable restriction. As John Stuart Mill argues in On Liberty, the despotism of custom is everywhere the standing hindrance to human advancement, revealing liberalism's inherent suspicion of communal bonds that might limit personal autonomy. For Mill, even long-standing traditions represent oppression when they conflict with individual self-determination. This radical individualism reduces community to a transactional partnership rather than an essential human condition. Social ties are valued only insofar as they serve personal interests. As John Locke's contractual view demonstrates, the reason why men enter into society is the preservation of their property. Here society exists not as an organic whole, but as a voluntary association of property owners establishing rules for mutual benefit. The liberal ideal of radical autonomy fundamentally undermines inherited social structures. No one chooses their family, class, culture, or civilization. These are given by circumstance. Liberalism transforms these accidents of birth into unjust constraints, framing them as limitations to be overcome rather than foundations to be nurtured. This worldview necessarily treats traditional identities as provisional. As Deneen observes, what begins as the right to change one's circumstances evolves into an obligation of constant self-reinvention, now extending even to fundamental categories like gender. We have not achieved liberation, but rather exchanged what Burke called the unbought grace of life for an exhausting regime of perpetual choice. The result is not empowerment, but disorientation, as the very frameworks that make meaningful choice possible are eroded. Yet this condition is neither natural nor inevitable. As Deneen emphasizes, sustaining such radical individualism requires extensive social engineering, a vast institutional apparatus to maintain what Locke and Mill envisioned. The two most powerful institutions being the market and the state. As liberalism advances, an ever-growing sphere of human decisions migrates from communal contexts to state and market institutions. This transfer has become so complete that modern political divisions now primarily concern which depersonalized institution should dominate, the state for progressives or the market for conservatives. Where communities once organized concrete responses to life's challenges, helping a family who lost their livelihood, rebuilding a neighbor's burned home, or caring for the sick, we now outsource these functions to impersonal systems. Insurance policies replace communal solidarity. Bureaucratic programs substitute for local cooperation. Deneen doesn't argue against insurance per se, but against how such institutional solutions systematically eliminate the need for mutual aid. What was once an occasion for social bonding becomes merely a financial transaction. The consequences manifest in what Robert Putnam termed Lonely America in his book Bowling Alone, a phenomenon observable across Western societies, long before smartphones and social media accelerated our isolation. Putnam documented the quiet retreat from public life into private solitude. Civic organizations atrophied, neighborhood ties weakened, and communal spaces emptied, all while state and market institutions expanded their domains. Once, friendship was a durable and essential part of life, built on shared experiences, proximity, and mutual reliance. But as societies grew more mobile and individualistic, the depth and stability of friendships eroded. People began prioritizing career advancement and personal autonomy over communal ties. The rise of suburbanization and longer work hours left less time for nurturing close, lifelong friendships. Marriage, once a near universal institution, has lost its staying power. Even as newlywed couples celebrate their unions, the foundations of marriage have grown weaker. The sexual revolution, the normalization of divorce, and the decline of religious adherence reshaped expectations around commitment. Economic pressures, stagnant wages, rising housing costs made marriage a financial risk rather than a stabilizing force. Couples now delay or forego marriage altogether, and those who do marry face higher odds of dissolution than in previous generations. The result is a society where marriage is no longer the assumed path to adulthood. Fertility rates have plummeted below replacement levels across the developed world. This is not merely a consequence of contraception or delayed childbearing, but reflects deeper cultural shifts. The meaning of family has changed. Children are now seen as expensive lifestyle choices rather than natural milestones. The decline of multi-generational households, the professional pressures on women, and the loss of social incentives for parenthood have all contributed. By the 1980s, birth rates were already in free fall in many nations, signaling a civilizational drift away from reproduction as a core value. Against this backdrop of fractured traditions, LGBTQ identification has surged, particularly among younger generations. This is not solely a product of greater tolerance, but also a symptom of the broader disintegration of fixed social roles, as heterosexual norms around marriage and child-rearing weakened. Alternative identities filled the void. In modern Western societies, the individual even has the freedom to relieve himself of the burden of life. Once considered a moral taboo, the deliberate ending of life is now increasingly framed as an act of compassion, autonomy, and even a human right. The trends examined in Bowling Alone point toward an end where we arrive at socially isolated individuals with no cultural or communal ties, awfully resembling the so-called feeble creatures described in Thomas Hobbes' State of Nature. Deneen argues that the growing disillusionment with liberalism stems from the failure of its own institutions, the free market and the centralized state, to serve the people they were meant to empower. Initially designed to liberate humanity from the constraints of nature and tradition, these structures have instead taken on an autonomous logic, becoming oppressive forces in their own right. As the liberal state consolidates power and the economy globalizes, they no longer function as tools of emancipation, but as impersonal systems to which individuals are increasingly subjugated. Compounding this problem is the rise of a new cosmopolitan elite. Liberalism once justified its revolt against the old aristocracy by appealing to meritocracy, promising a fairer society where talent, not birth, determined success. Yet the modern liberal elite has replicated the very vices it once condemned. Institutional exclusivity, evidenced by legacy admissions in elite universities, extreme wealth concentration, and a detachment from the communities they ostensibly govern. Worse still, this new aristocracy is no longer bound by national loyalties. Its members float between global metropolises, sharing more in common with one another than with the rural and local populations left behind by economic and cultural globalization. The result is a profound divergence between the liberal elite and the rest of society. Where liberalism promised unity through progress, it has instead fostered alienation. Its institutions, once framed as instruments of liberation, now entrench new forms of domination, no longer by nature or tradition, but by bureaucracy, market forces, and a self-perpetuating ruling class. The crisis of liberalism, then, is not merely ideological but practical. Its mechanisms have escaped democratic control, and its beneficiaries have become a new oligarchy, leaving the original promise of freedom and equality unfulfilled. The fundamental flaw of modern conservatism is that it has never practiced actual conservatism. The most heated political debates today are not, as they appear, clashes between two distinct ideologies offering competing visions for society. Rather, they are disputes between two branches of the same underlying philosophy. On one side stands the right, championing economic liberalism, emphasizing individualism, free markets, and personal autonomy. On the other side, the left advocates progressive liberalism, which seeks to harness state power to correct systemic injustices, whether racial, gendered, or economic. Superficially, these positions seem diametrically opposed, yet both share the same foundational assumptions: the primacy of the individual as the basic unit of political concern, and the delegation of decision-making to impersonal institutions, be it the market for the right or the state for the left. The disagreements are not philosophical but tactical, revolving around which liberal mechanisms should take precedence in shaping society. This convergence leaves conservatism in a paradoxical position. On critical issues such as gender ideology or immigration, self-proclaimed conservatives often find themselves unable to mount a coherent opposition, because they too operate within liberal presuppositions. Rather than articulating a distinct conservative alternative, They merely react to progressive advances, retreating into nostalgic appeals to an idealized past without interrogating the ideological forces that eroded that past in the first place. The result is a movement that is fundamentally reactive rather than constructive. Modern conservatism does not offer a positive vision, but instead oscillates between defensive postures and attempts to restore an earlier status quo, one that was itself shaped by liberal norms. This reactive stance ensures that conservatism is perpetually redefined by its opponents, forced to adapt to progressive frameworks rather than challenging them at their roots. Consequently, the conservative movement lacks coherence over time. A progressive from the 1930s would find far more common ground with a contemporary progressive than a conservative from 2 decades ago would with one today. If conservatism is to present a genuine alternative to liberalism, it must break free from liberal constraints. This requires rediscovering intellectual traditions that predate and transcend liberalism, particularly classical virtue ethics, which emphasizes communal bonds, moral character, and the common good over individual autonomy. It also demands rethinking the atomized conception of society that liberalism takes for granted. Politics cannot be reduced to a contest between state control and market freedom. It must instead grapple with deeper questions about human flourishing, social order, and the institutions that sustain them. Until conservatism dares to step outside the liberal paradigm, it will remain what it is today, not a rival to progressive liberalism, but its uneasy shadow.